A little while back, I tackled some Space Skaven. In that video, I only built a single infantryman, but I've been meaning to come back to these sci-fi rodents and give them something a little bigger. So I decided to build a rat mech. The basis of this conversion came from the Necromunda Prometheum tank. I took a lot of inspiration from the mechs found in Scythe and Iron Harvest and wanted to recreate that boxy, rugged look, so these industrial storage tanks were perfect for that. While the Promethean tank would serve as the main body, the mech needed legs and armaments, and these would be graciously provided by an Onager Dunecrawler. I focused on the legs first, and after removing and cleaning up the parts, assembled the legs as per the instructions, but left the 4 armor panels separate. A lot of Mechanicus vehicles feature Baroque banding, which wouldn't quite fit into the industrial style that I was trying to recreate. So these were removed. My knife was used to first trim back the bulk of the banding before shaving the surface smooth. This was repeated across the 4 panels, leaving me with some slightly less stylized armor. With the legs built, a way of attaching them to the Prometheum tank needed to be devised. The Onager already featured a ball joint, and I felt that this would make sense to retain, as it would offer me some options for customization. The socket was created by first clipping away the small nub from the underside of the tank, which did give me a small hole, but it wasn't quite big enough. To expand this, I opted to use my Dremel. I could have carefully clipped, cut and filed down the plastic, but this would have required a lot more time and effort to achieve. I steadily expanded the hole until the ball socket was fitting snugly before gluing the legs into place. One problem I would face in building a vehicle out of an Imperial kit was that it wouldn't have been obvious who was piloting it. I needed to have one of the crew popping its head out of the hatch, which was unfortunately fused shut on the Promethean tank's lid. To build a new hatch, I first compared the Dunecrawler's cupula against the top, which gave me a rough idea of how much space I needed to make. From here, the hatch's handle was clipped away and a hole was drilled directly into the center. Making use of my Dremel once again, this drilled hole was expanded in order to create an opening wide enough for the mech's commander to squeeze through. The cupula was brought in again for another comparison, and here I found that there were still a few trims required to be made to the underside of the hatch in order for it to fit. With everything lining up, it could be glued into place. Like with the earlier armor panels and the legs, the hatch also featured that Baroque styling, and like before, it was also shaved back and flattened before being glued to the cupula, completing the commander's hatch. With the base and the lid of the tank complete, work could begin on the midsection, where the actual weaponry would be attached. But first, one layer of Promethean tank walls were glued to the tank's base. The weaponry for this mech would, of course, be sourced from the Onager Dunecrawler kit. The side-mounted turret was assembled before being compared against one of the pipe couplings that comes with the Promethean tank kit. While one side of the coupling would fit perfectly against the main body of the mech, the other side needed to be clipped and filed flat in order to allow the turret to be attached to it. The neutron laser was selected for the main armament, as I felt that this, out of all the weapons, was the most likely to have a use as a mining laser or similar heavy-duty tool that has been repurposed as a weapon. The turret was looking a little front-heavy though, so the mantlet from one of the other weapon options was glued to the rear, helping to bulk out the weapon somewhat. Into the 2 empty holes, some piping from the Dunecrawler was fixed into place after a little trimming to help it to fit. From here, I then set about adding various details to the vehicle by repurposing parts from both the Onager and the Promethean tank kits. For example, some of the Onager headlights were glued to the front of the tank before a Promethean tank ladder was placed over the top, giving the appearance of a vision port with some additional protection added. Similarly, more optics and rails were added to the lid of the tank, again helping to move the shape away from the perfectly uniform storage tank and more towards a functional vehicle. It was at this point that I decided to add the commander of the mech. Previously, I built my Skaven around the Genestealer cults, but since that time, the Leagues of Votann were released. Not only were the Hearthkin bodies the ideal height for Skaven, but I also found it incredibly ironic that Space Skaven would be using armor similar to in style to the Space Dwarves. In order to get this chunky torso to fit, a small pouch from the belt did need to be clipped away and trimmed back. But with this done and the torso assembled, the torso was double checked against the hole once again. In order for the commander to be poking out of the top, I needed to support it in some way, and this would be achieved with the ever useful technique of pinning. A 1mm hole was drilled into the commander's foot, followed by another into the base of the tank, just where the onager's ball joint poked through. Some 1mm thick florist wire was then superglued into the foot before being clipped, so about 3 inches or so were left protruding. I dry fitted the lid on the top of the tank and the wire into the hole inside the tank. This gave me an idea of how much of the wire needed to be cut back. Over a few steady increments, the wire was clipped to length until the commander's torso was sitting properly above the copula. While the wire and the lid were still in place, some suitable Votan arms were selected and attached before comparing a Skaven Stormvermin head against the neck. For the most part, the two parts fit, but a little trimming was required to get the head sitting at the correct angle. Once I was happy with the trims, the head was attached to the torso, and the lid of the tank was finally glued to the rest of it, completing the main structure. But there were still a few details to add. While I'm a fan of asymmetric mechs, our Skaven mech was looking a little too lopsided and needed something on the right side in order to better balance out their profile. A rough power plant was constructed from an ammo crate found in the Promethean tank kit, but first some of the onager's spare handles were attached to the lid. This was done by first drilling pairs of holes across the lid and gluing the handles into them, giving them a little more stability. The lid was then glued to the crate, and the whole thing was glued to the mech's right hand side. Finally, various random components found in both kits were attached to the mech's surface. This kind of kit bashing finds its roots in a lot of models built for sci-fi films, and is excellent for adding a little extra surface detail and giving your models that techy, futuristic look. With this done, the model was complete and ready to be attached to its base. But first, I wanted to add a little rocky ground texture, and this would be achieved with some cork floor tile. The position of the mech's legs were marked out with a pencil before some rough pieces of cork were torn up and attached to the base with superglue. This made the larger rocks, but for the smaller rubble, some pre-chopped pieces of cork were added too. PVA glue was painted on around the larger chunks before being sprinkled with the small chunks. With this done, the glue was allowed to dry. I began the painting process by priming everything black. I used an airbrush for this, along with some of Vallejo's black primer. This primer would create a much better surface to paint on and would also help to contribute to the zenithal shading I'd be forming in the next step. Zenithal shading is a great way to add a little extra realism to your highlights and shadows by lighting up the areas you'd expect light to naturally fall on. It involves taking a white paint, such as Tamiya's XF2 white that I used here, and thinning it out in an airbrush with some airbrush thinners. You're looking for a consistency that is not too dissimilar to milk here. I lightly sprayed this mixture onto the model from above, meaning that the paint formed mainly on the upper surfaces and left the undersides and the recesses as the base black primer, mimicking the shadows and brighter surfaces created by a natural light source. While applying this, I tried to concentrate mainly on the main body of the mech, leaving the legs as untouched as possible. When deciding on a paint scheme for this miniature, I decided to continue that industrial styling and go full JCB and paint the model in a predominantly yellow and black scheme. The yellow paint I had settled on for this was some dark sun yellow from the 2 thin coats range, and, like with the white before, it was thinned out of my airbrush and applied across the main body. The white undercoat really helped to bring out the brightness in the yellow here, and resulted in a much more intense colour than if I'd been applied straight over black. With a decent coat of yellow in place, some of the pre-shading was pushed even further by adding some Boar Hide shadows. This reddish-brown paint was added to my airbrush before being sprayed into the recesses and undersides. This not only built up the existing shadows, but also gave the yellow a little more warmth. To give the yellow a little more intensity, some yellow flame was then sprayed onto the upward-facing part of the mech, further increasing the contrast against the shadows and building up the level of detail. The legs of the mech would be black, but in order to protect the yellow, a little masking was done first. Then, some of the extremely dark grey of Death Reaper was sprayed across the legs. Again, I mainly focused the application from above so that the black primer in the recesses would be retained. Rather than using greys to highlight, I instead opted for the bluish grey of Cold Corpse Blue. The cooler tone of this contrasted strongly against the warm yellow, further boosting its intensity. Like with the earlier yellow flame, this paint was just lightly sprayed over the top edges of the legs. For the time being, I was done with the airbrush and would be focusing on some regular brush applications. The first of these was a little cleanup of some of the lenses, pipes and details scattered across the tank. Like with the legs, I wanted them to be dark, so applied some more Death Reaper over them. As these are base coats, I'd recommend thinning down your paint first with a little water and then applying a couple of thinner coats rather than a single thick one. Having such a pristine looking yellow in this model, especially for something being maintained by the Skaven, seemed a little odd. So, to remedy this, some battle damage was added. This was done with a lump of sponge foam that had been torn up to create a messy and uneven edge. This was dipped into some Cuirass Leather and then stippled across the yellow surface. The small reddish-brown flecks that the sponge left behind created the appearance of scratches, peeling paint and rust patches in the painted surface. The sponge was great for quick and uneven applications, but for some finer scratches and patches of rust, these were applied by using a regular brush too. Following on from the scratches, some of the details in the yellow were picked out with an edge highlight of yellow flame. In addition to picking out the edges of hatches and armor panels, I also used this to paint a line alongside a few of the deeper scratches. This helped to give them a more pronounced, almost three-dimensional appearance. While I'd put in a lot of effort into lightening and bringing out some of the edges of the yellow areas, the recesses in some areas were too light. These would be darkened down by applying a targeted wash of Battle Mud Wash. The wash flowed into the recesses, creating the appearance of shadows that helped to make the details stand out even further. In order to highlight the black areas of the model, some wolf grey was used in order to continue that bluish grey hue. I kept the highlights fairly rough and scratchy in order to give these areas a worn and damaged look. With the mech completed for the time being, the Skaven commander could be focused on. I settled on an off-white for the armour, taking inspiration from some of the traditional colours of Clan Skryre. I began first of all with a base coat of Skeleton Legion, which was followed up with a few thin glazes of Vampire Fang. These were painted mainly on the upper facing areas, leaving the deeper recesses and lower points as the darker Skeleton Legion. The recesses were then further darkened with a targeted wash of Archaic Sepia. Like with the yellow areas, damage was added to the Skaven's armour using some Cuirass Leather, followed by some edge highlights and scratches of Trooper White. The undersuit and weapon were tackled in the same way as the black areas of the legs, starting off with a base coat of Death Reaper, then a layer of Cold Corpse Blue, and finally a highlight of Wolf Grey. For the rat's fur, Scorched Earth was used first, followed by a layer of Ancient Forest, and then a highlight of Wasteland Brown. The small amount of skin was base coated with Barbarian Brawn, then layered with Dwarven Skin, and then highlighted with some Elven Skin. To help add a little colour to the legs of the mech and to paint the pistol, I decided to paint these areas red. I started off with Berserker Red, which was followed up with a layer of Sanguine Scarlet, and then finally a little Demon Red for the edges. In addition to the visible Skaven commander, another way of differentiating the mech from a regular Imperial vehicle was to add some Skaven markings to the surface. So, using a fine brush and some marine blue, a series of Skaven runes were added across the surface of the armour. The final step in painting the Skaven mech was to add some glowing effects to the various light sources dotted across the model. To start off this process, these light-emitting areas were given a base coat of Trooper White. A few thin layers were needed to get the best coverage possible here. To create a bright glowing warpstone green effect, I used some of the FX Fluor Experience range from Scale 75, specifically some Techno Green. This paint was thinned out and first applied over and around the light-emitting surfaces. The trick here is to apply the paint in many thin layers in order to build up the intensity and the effect of the brightness steadily. Once the light sources themselves have been painted, the surfaces that sat close by were also tackled in order to boost the realism of the glowing light. Techno Green had a slightly cooler tone that I wanted, so to help bring that warmth without impacting the vibrancy of the glow, I applied some thin layers of Speed Yellow over the top. Now this process was repeated across multiple areas of the mech. In some cases, to really strengthen the glowing effect, I decided to paint the lit areas with a little trooper white first. The final result was that of a bright green glows that allude to a warpstone-like power source. The final area to paint was the base. I settled on a red oxide Mars-like surface, and to create this, I used some of AK Interactive's Fireland texture paste. This was layered across the entire base to give it a distinctive red colour, whilst also helping to add some additional topography. After being allowed to fully dry, the gritty texture was picked out with a series of dry brushes, using increasingly brighter oranges. I began with a light layer of rust orange, then Fanatic Orange, and finally some orange flame to pick out the very edges of the larger rocks. To give the impression of dust building up in the recesses of the legs, I took a little more rust orange and heavily thinned it out with water to create a wash. This was applied in and around the details. Once dry, it would simulate the appearance of accumulated dust and debris. And with that, the model was very nearly completed. All that was left to do now was to glue the loose parts into place, clean up the rim of the base with a layer of Doom Death Black, and give everything a coat of matte varnish to seal in the paintwork and remove any remaining glossiness, which left me with this. And here we have the finished Skaven mech. It's always fun to take on kitbashes where there isn't anything predefined and you can just build whatever you feel like. Space Skaven are perfect for this, as we already have a rough expectation of what they'd be like in the 41st millennium, but without anything concrete, you have complete freedom to build whatever you like. So, while this is based heavily on a dune crawler, and you could use those rules for it on the tabletop, I'd actually love to hear what you guys think this thing should be called and what its rules should be. Also, if you enjoyed this guide and would like to see more homebrew designs or even just more Space Skaven, then let me know in the comments below. For those of you looking to recreate this miniature and colour scheme, I'll include all of the kits and paints used in this guide in the description below, along with some affiliate links to where you can pick them up for yourself. Now, just before I go, let me say a big thank you to the ever wonderful patrons who keep this channel going, especially my expert tier and above supporters who are Big Tom, Jonathan Hart, Maciej Savitsky, Tim, Brushlicker Nim, Daniel Dowling, Joachim Falk, Jonathan Sandsteed, Casper Limborg, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Pale Juice, Swedsman, and the Googles. If you're interested in supporting me too, you can find a link to my Patreon below, where supporters can get ad-free access to my videos, sneak peeks, a private Discord channel, and exclusive merchandise. Plus, you'll be helping me out in the process. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.